Hi, my name is George for SOE 300 Natural Resource Ecology, and today I'm going to be doing a presentation on Kamiak Butte. In this presentation, I'll be discussing 5 different key aspects of Kamiak Butte. These 5 will be the geological formation of Kamiak Butte, as well as eastern Washington, the biome in which Kamiak Butte resides and what that means, the climate of Kamiak Butte and what causes it to be the way that it is, Kamiak Butte tree coverage and how that relates to the soil composition of the butte, as well as carbon sequestration, and finally, the organisms and trophic interactions between them on Kamiak Butte. About 300 million years ago, the supercontinent Pangaea had been formed by the collision of several continents that would later become the continents that we know today. Around 150 million years ago, Pangaea began to break into separate parts. Around 66 million years ago, the North American continent had come to closely resemble its modern-day shape. However, at this point, Washington was still almost entirely submerged underwater, and remained so until about 50 million years ago. The Washington as we know it today would then be created by plate tectonics interactions. As the oceanic Farallon plate subducted below the North American plate, the continental plate of North America was pressed upwards, revealing the west coast of North America, including eastern Washington. As this oceanic plate maintained its continued subduction below the continental North American plate, land on the west coast continued to rise above sea level. The ocean floor that became eastern Washington, as well as much of the west coast of North America, was at the time comprised of quartzite rock. This quartzite rock is the foundation of what makes Kamiak Butte geologically unique when compared to the Palouse and most of the geological formations surrounding it. The subduction zone created by the subduction of the one-day Fuca plate under the North American plate has a critical impact on the geology of Kamiak Butte. As the oceanic plate subducts below the continent, large amounts of magma are created as the plate is forced into the asthenosphere. The increased heat and pressure here causes the oceanic plate to melt and rise up into the crust above, forming magma chambers. This process is responsible for the creation of the andesite volcanoes, which make up the modern Cascade Mountain range of western Washington. This process is also responsible for the flood basalts that have come to conquer so much of the geology of eastern Washington. The uprising of magma from the asthenosphere up into the lithosphere caused by tectonic plate subduction is responsible for the creation of massive flood basalts. From 17 to 14 million years ago, massive lava flows from migrating vents began to erupt and cover much of modern Washington and Oregon with lava rock. These eruptions formed the Columbia River flood basalts, which are the youngest flood basalt province in the world. The quartzite-based mountains and rocks were completely buried under miles of igneous rock. In many places, the flood basalts are 2 to 3 miles deep, and they cover about 63,000 square miles of land. Only a select few tall quartzite mountain peaks remain unburied by the basalt, one of which is Kamiak Butte. Around 2.6 million years ago, the last ice age began. The average global temperature lowered, and atmospheric humidity, along with lake and ocean water moisture, were captured and sequestered as glacial ice. These glaciers spent the next several million years traveling south until they discovered a significant portion of Washington. Then, about 11,700 years ago, some of this ice began to melt as average global temperatures rose, and this great glacial mass began to break apart. The increased amount of precipitation from melting ice and increased rain accumulated and began to flow into river channels. This would eventually result in the creation of floods that flowed through much of eastern Washington in multiple freeze and thaw cycles over the course of thousands of years. They always sought the path of least resistance through which to flow and carried ice and sediment with them and carved through much of the basalt rock layer below. Winds from the Pacific Ocean flew up the Columbia River Gorge into eastern Washington and blew lake-bed Loess soils into the area. Powerful winds blew east from the Portland area, picking up fine-grained silt and topsoil and depositing much of it into the modern-day Palouse. Much of this soil was highly fertile, and thus has resulted in the Palouse being a highly agriculturally productive area. Kamiak Butte, much like the rest of the Palouse, is covered in rich and fertile Loess soils. However, Kamiak Butte is at the peak of a quartzite mountain, one of the few places in the area that does not sit upon a basalt substrate. When water from precipitation reaches the soil that rests upon a basalt substrate, the impermeable basalt rock helps the soil retain moisture. Quartzite is much more permeable to water than the basalt substrate is, meaning that Kamiak Butte is much less suited to use as agricultural land than the surrounding area. Kamiak Butte, as well as the Palouse and much of eastern Washington, is a part of the North American western interior shrublands and woodlands biome. This biome is partially created by the Columbia Plateau basalt layer, which helps trap moisture in the Loess soil above, aiding plant growth. Shrublands get slightly more rain than deserts, but also get less than areas that are well forested. Additionally, this type of biome tends to be hot and dry, particularly during the summer, with relatively cool winters. summer temperatures can reach over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, whilst winter temperatures can reach below 30. In North America, shrublands and woodlands biomes can be found throughout the continent. The same biome can be found in the Columbia Basin Plateau, the Great Basin, which is located in northern Nevada, and the Colorado Plateau, which stretches across Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. Throughout the world, a similar biome can be found in places like Mexico, Chile, Southern Africa, and Australia. Eastern Washington and its surrounding areas get their winds from the maritime polar air masses. Air masses are large bodies of air that have a similar temperature and moisture level throughout. Maritime polar air masses move eastward into Washington from the Pacific Ocean. In summertime, these air masses can cause cool, moist, and foggy climate on the coast. During wintertime, maritime polar air masses can result in heavy snowfall and snowstorms. In general, maritime polar air masses result in a cooler and wetter climate, and this is generally true for much of eastern Washington, though not as much for eastern Washington or Kamiak Butte. This is because of the rain shadow effect, which prevents much of the cool air and moisture from the Pacific from reaching eastern Washington. Eastern Washington and western Washington have radically different climates, with the west having a moist, cold environment with heavy rainfall and fog, and the east being mostly arid and hot shrubland. The rain shadow effect is mainly responsible for this. The rain shadow effect can take place when a mountain range is present on or near the coast of a continent. The presence of a mountain range, in this case the Cascades, causes moist and cool air from the ocean to rise in elevation when it meets the mountain range. The rising air becomes cooler and lowers in pressure, causing its water vapor carrying capacity to decrease. Because of this, rising, cooling air forms precipitation, which causes the western side of Washington to get higher levels of rainfall and fog. As air reaches the eastern side of the Cascades, it drops in elevation again, increasing its capacity to hold water as vapor, thereby lessening the amount of precipitation that forms. This dry side of the mountain is called the rain shadow area. It is because of this effect that Kamiak Butte, as well as most of eastern Washington, receives very little rainfall. Kamiak Butte is a dry and arid shrubland that reaches greater extremes of both high and low temperatures than most places on the west side of Washington. Kamiak Butte reaches an average of 21.36 inches of rainfall per year on average, making it quite a bit lower than anywhere in western Washington. The average yearly temperature of Kamiak Butte is 46.55 degrees Fahrenheit. The average lowest temperature recorded per year is 22.18 degrees Fahrenheit, and the average maximum is 82.26 degrees Fahrenheit. Interestingly enough, Kamiak Butte's average temperature has been rising over the last 100 or so years. Pre-1950, the average temperature of Kamiak Butte was 46.42 degrees Fahrenheit, and post-1950, it is 46.66 degrees Fahrenheit. Tree coverage on Kamiak Butte is somewhat unique, given its divided nature. The tree coverage on the north aspect of Kamiak Butte is quite distinct from the south aspect of Kamiak Butte. On the north side, there are 3 different species of tree present, with varying levels of presence between them. These are the Douglas fir, the ponderosa pine, and the western larch. Together, these north aspect trees had an area coverage of an estimated 158 trees per acre. The Douglas fir was easily the most dominant tree present on the northern aspect, with an estimated 130 Douglas fir trees per acre, whereas the ponderosa pine and western larch were found to be around 9 and 19 trees per acre, respectively. The trees present on the north side were tall, averaging 99.4 feet tall. Overall, the trees present on the northern aspect of Kamiak Butte were varied in species, comparatively tall, wide, and covered a much greater area than the trees on the southern aspect. These factors have multiple effects on the plant and animal life present on this side of the butte. The tree coverage on the southern aspect of Kamiak Butte is very different to that of the northern aspect. One immediately apparent difference between tree coverage on the south versus the north side of Kamiak Butte is that the south side's trees per acre is significantly lower. The southern aspect has only about 35 trees per acre, several times lower than the frequency of trees on the northern aspect. Additionally, there is no diversity of tree species on the southern aspect. The Douglas fir and western larch trees that populate the northern aspect are noticeably missing on the southern side, where only ponderosa pine grows. These ponderosa pine trees are also much smaller on average than the trees on the northern aspect, averaging only 34.4 feet tall. One of the impacts of the two sides of Kamiak Butte having such different amounts of tree coverage is that the south and north-facing aspects have much different amounts of carbon sequestration. Because of the greater abundance of trees present on the north-facing aspect of the butte, there is much more biomass present, and thus much more carbon sequestered. In total, the estimated amount of carbon sequestered by Kamiak Butte trees on the north-facing aspects was 422,043 pounds. Of this total, the Douglas fir captured 366,074 pounds of carbon, the majority of the carbon stored. The western larch captured 37,755 pounds of carbon, and the ponderosa pine captured a total of 18,214 pounds of carbon. Per tree, the ponderosa pine sequestered more carbon than the other trees, storing 53.5% of its dry biomass as carbon. The Douglas fir captured only 50.7%, and the western larch captured 49.3%. The much more sparse tree coverage of the southern-facing aspect results in much less carbon sequestered in tree biomass. Though the ponderosa pine captures much more carbon proportionally than the other tree species on Kamiak Butte, the greatly reduced biomass present on the southern aspect means that carbon sequestration is much lower here. In total, trees captured 34,362 pounds of carbon on the south-facing aspect. When combined with the data from the northern aspect, we can find that in total, 456,405 pounds of carbon are sequestered in tree biomass on Kamiak Butte. These trees also serve as primary producers for Kamiak Butte. Primary producers are the origin point of energy in any given organic system. Primary producers, aka autotrophs, can create energy from inorganic material, mainly from solar radiation via the process of photosynthesis. Primary producers are the foundation upon which all organic systems stand, and the nature of the primary producers in any given system tell us a lot about the organic systems to which they belong. These trees help shape the ecosystem around them and serve important functions, both for the plants and animals they interact with, providing shade to much of the undergrowth beneath and keeping direct sunlight from hitting the north face of Kamiak Butte for more than a few hours a day. This helps create a shaded, cool environment and helps plant undergrowth thrive. Additionally, these trees interact with other living organisms such as squirrels and birds by providing a shelter and possible mating spot to these animals. Not all the primary producers present on Kamiak Butte are towering pine trees, however. Much of the plant life on Kamiak Butte is much smaller. The north-facing aspect is where you can find most of these organisms. Some examples of these are the western trillium, a flower commonly found living among coniferous forests, the yellow fritillary, a flower common to sagebrush country, and fairy slippers, a purple flower found in coniferous forests, bogs, and floodplains. On the south side of Kamiak Butte, the steep-sloped, sun-exposed surface does not allow for a thick and dense tree canopy above. As a result, the plant life on the south side is much different than that on the north side. Most south side plant life consists of grasses and brushy plants, like the ironwood shrub and the mallow ninebark, two brush plants more suitable to life on the south side of Kamiak Butte than the north. These smaller plant organisms provide much value to their ecosystems, where they serve as shelter for many rodents and insects, as well as a food source for the primary consumers present, which in turn helps provide energy to the entire ecosystem. Primary consumers are the next level up in trophic levels after primary producers. Primary consumers are the organisms that eat the producers. For this reason, primary consumers are mostly herbivorous, though some omnivores also qualify. One example of a primary consumer would be a deer. Deer are primary consumers, as their diet consists almost entirely of plant life. In Kamiak Butte, as well as the surrounding Palouse, there are two main species of deer that can be found, the white-tailed deer and the mule deer. These two species likely share a fairly recent common ancestor and have some similarities in terms of diet and behavior. Mule deer are native specifically to the western side of North America, whereas the white-tailed deer can be found throughout much of the continent. Both species of deer eat a similar diet, consisting mainly of leaves, shoots, grasses, and legumes. Both species also have similar predators. In the Pacific Northwest, this means mainly coyotes, cougars, and bears. Primary producers are the next step in the trophic ladder and provide a primary food source to many of the carnivores present in their ecosystems. Carnivores are secondary and tertiary consumers. They eat other animals. Secondary consumers eat primary consumers, whereas tertiary consumers might also eat secondary consumers. Birds can be one example of secondary or tertiary consumers. These birds come in two main types in the Palouse. The first type are the smaller non-raptors. These include species like the gold-crowned kinglet. Gold-crowned kinglets are a tiny songbird that can be spotted at Kamiak Butte flying quickly from branch to branch. Their diet consists mainly of insects. There are also larger birds of prey present at Kamiak Butte. The great horned owl is one such animal. The great horned owl is a ferocious predator, being capable of taking down prey that is quite large. They are mostly nocturnal, and their diet consists of rodents such as rats, mice, rabbits, squirrels, skunks, and others, as well as smaller birds and even other owls. Also several mammalian carnivores that occupy the upper levels of the food chain on Kamiak Butte. One would be the coyote. These predators are widespread throughout North America, and their diet is similarly broad. They are known to feed on carrion, being rather opportunistic eaters, and they also feed on small animals, such as rabbits, squirrels, and mice, as well as larger animals, such as mule deer, elk calves, and even domestic livestock. Another predator common to the Palouse is also the namesake of Washington State University, the cougar. It is the largest cat in the northern U.S. and can weigh up to 170 pounds. They primarily eat mule deer, who make up about 75% of the cougar's yearly diet, though they will still eat smaller animals and even insects. Cougars tend to prefer semi-mountainous habitats or woodland. However, cougars are quite capable of moving very long distances, and they live in a wide variety of environments. These examples of tertiary and secondary consumers are also key parts of any ecosystem. At Kamiak Butte, these consumers keep the ecosystem balanced by keeping primary consumers in check. The topics briefly covered in this presentation have hopefully given you some idea about Kamiak Butte, what makes it unique, and what makes it a great example for the study of natural resource ecology. Thank you for listening.